Okay, welcome. Welcome everyone to Thrive, Lead, Succeed. I'm your host, Sandi Hokansson, Executive Coach and CEO of Sound Leadership. Coming up today, we're going to dig into the important and complex topic of mergers and acquisitions and how leaders best navigate through those waters. We have a subject matter expert with us today. We have a very special guest, Tyra Tutor, who is CEO of TAD PGS, and I'm going to introduce Tyra to you all in just a minute. And I think there'll be some applications for all of you outside of, if you're not currently involved in an M&A situation right now, there are some takeaways outside of that. So stay tuned for those as well. Let me just move along here. For those new to the circle, I'd just like to remind everyone that's already part of the community, and for those new, that this is a forum for like-minded leaders to inspire each other. And that's our tagline, leaders inspiring leaders. So we learn from each other and we invest in our leadership practice. And I host several webinars throughout the year with a variety of different leaders from the community. And you can find the previous circle sessions on my website at soundleadership.ca/resources. And the last session that we were together, we had an amazing guest, Dr. Jennifer Decker, who's a leading scientist based out of Germany. And she spoke to us on creating a global network and shared her career path and how she has built a worldwide community. So if you want to find that and hear some of our previous speakers, please go to the resources either on my website or the YouTube channel. So we're going to shift gears now and get into our topic today and move into our conversation. So I'm going to introduce Tyra to you all now, and I'm thrilled that, Tyra, we have the chance to do this together. Tyra and I worked together for several years, so I can attest to her leadership savvy, her intelligence, and her know-how firsthand. She's an accountant, and with a master's, in tax and accounting. She did a stint at PwC in her early career. And then she switched gears and moved up the ladder in several different strategic leadership roles. And she oversaw mergers and acquisitions and working for a variety of different organizations under different leaders. So she's done it a few times. So she is considered, as I mentioned earlier, one of the top people, that has experience in this in my network anyway. And currently she serves as CEO of TAD PGS, a government solutions company that is owned by a large publicly traded organization. So welcome, Tyra. It's wonderful to have you with us today and looking forward to our conversation and digging into this complex topic.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sandi.
Okay, so let's dig in. Why don't you start by telling us here a little bit about your background with mergers and acquisitions and how many you've been a part of and what your role has been.
Okay. So the number's pretty large, I think, if you ask someone how many deals they've been part of. If you're not in the brokerage world, it's over 100, which I realize is lucky to have the opportunity to work for a company that was so acquisitive, even though a lot of them were small and sometimes a couple in the same week. It was a great way to start my career early and then sort of stayed as part of my job up until my most recent change. I was on the buy side most of the time. So we were buying up companies to either get a new geographic location or a new type of staffing. My industry has mostly been in the staffing world. My largest deal by far would have been on the team that sold MPS Group to Adecco in 2010. So for that deal, I was actually on the sales side. And then once I became part of Adecco, actually we divested of 2 or 3 small businesses. So I got to see kind of that sell side, buy side difference, which is it's good experience to sometimes feel what it's like to be on the other side of things. early on, my role was more, figuring out the tax strategy, obviously with my background, writing up summaries, looking for risks, looking for opportunities, participating in diligence. And then as I moved along with my career, it became more strategic, negotiating, finding the companies, closing them, sometimes even part of integrating them. I would say 2010 was a real change. That was the year that MPS was bought by Adecco, and I became part of the acquired company. At first, I was just going to be a consultant for a year to help with the integration. And before that year was up, I was asked to be the head of M&A for the Adecco Group in North America. And then that allowed me to buy back franchises, which MPS did not have, and divest a few entities, and led me for 10 years until I took this role at TAD at the beginning of 2020. And it was the first time I wasn't at corporate. I was in the field, and I've enjoyed it. And I am amazed sometimes that some of that M&A skill set comes to play in the day-to-day world of being a president and CEO. So I feel very glad to have this as part of my history. I miss it some days, but I do like my new role.
Good, good. Wow, 100 deals. That's very impressive. That's a little bit few more than I even realized you were a part of. And I really liked you sharing a little bit about the sell and the buy sides, and I'm sure that really gave you a lot of more intelligence about, the navigation on both of those dynamics to build into your, strategy when you were buying in the future, because you knew what it like to, you knew what it was like to sell at that point. Tell us a little bit about kind of the best and the worst scenario you faced, just to give us a little bit of flavor here to some of these deals. And you obviously, we're not looking for all the confidential details, but just give us a little flavor of some of the things here that you've experienced.
So when I think about kind of the best, I would say that I didn't realize it was the best at the time, but some of you on the call know David Alexander. I know he spoke at one of these round circles, Sound for You, Sandi. And I remember a few years after the deal, he thanked me. It was a good fit. He enjoyed being part of the group, and it just created a lot of pride in knowing that he was as happy as the company was. It was a win-win for both, and sometimes deals don't turn out that way. And in this case, it really was a perfect fit, and just to get a thank you was memorable. And that's the first thing that comes to mind when I think about maybe the best. And similarly, on the worst, I remember having to call 3 different people very, very late in the deal process to tell them we weren't closing the deal. And 2 of those 3 times were because of the economy. They just really waited too late. We didn't get the deal closed. The market crashed, and they had pretty much spent that money, and it never happened. And there was one franchise deal for Adecco where they lost a big client right before we closed, and we had to pull the deal. And, I think those personal memories come up in my mind the most when I think of best and worst. Financially, I could also answer it that way, just looking at what did we make the most return on. But that's not what you remember. It's really the people you met, the people you helped, the people that you didn't help, that comes to mind first.
Yeah, that's insightful. It just shows us that it's all based on relationships, even when it's high finance and lots is at stake, right? So that's good. So let's get right into assessing firms. So you've had a lot of experience in this. So what do you look for when you're assessing whether this firm is right? You're on the buy side and you're looking to grow your organization. What's most important?
Yeah. Well, it's hard not to say the numbers. And when you're doing deals, sometimes you have to remind yourself it's not all about the numbers, but it sort of is all about the numbers. I mean, if the numbers don't work, it's a no-go. So you never get to the other stuff, really. So you focus on the numbers from the beginning, and then even when you're looking at fit and culture and risk and opportunities, everything, it's still going to impact those numbers, those assumptions you made in those financials early on. And when you're looking at the numbers, you've got to consider, are there sales synergies? Are there cost synergies? And it's very easy to get out of control on what you think you can save and the sales you can gain together. And you have to be realistic. You've got to have somebody realistic on your team. You know, some people may call them like a Debbie Downer, but you do need someone that will punch holes in those assumptions, because it never works out perfectly. And if you're too aggressive up front with some of those assumptions, you're just setting yourself up for failure. So I always was maybe sometimes even too risk averse, but I think that the deals will be more successful if you do not lose sight of that. And I've had bosses that just wanted to get a certain deal done, and that can be risky. But once you get past the numbers, then you do have to look at fit and culture and determine if it can work, because you can mess up a deal even if the numbers look really good going into it.
Yeah, culture has a big role to play, as you say, even if the numbers are looking good. Excellent. That was really insightful there as well. So tell us a little bit about due diligence around it. Is there a certain process you follow to that you could highlight to actually figure out if the numbers make sense, or you know, how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's checklist after checklist, and you know, just from a practical standpoint, you know, we had our due diligence checklist, and every time something went wrong with the previous deal, you added in a few more questions that you wanted to get addressed during the diligence process. And there's always something unique with the deal. So you have to just keep digging until the very end, because sometimes the sellers just might not want to tell you everything up front. So it's up to you to really figure out the right questions to ask. And probably the best advice is, if you aren't completely familiar with the industry or that vertical, make sure you have someone on your team who is, because your weakness of not knowing can get you in trouble if you're not asking the right questions. And then I would say, you know, there's a couple of deals I remember that we walked away from because we just didn't trust the other side. And if you can't trust them early on in the process, that's not going to get any better. And so at some point you need to have enough confidence just to say, you know what, I'm not, they have to be hiding something. Something just isn't adding up, and walk away and look for another deal. I can think of one example too, where we were clearly not getting all of the straight answers, but we really trusted the number two. And we were confident enough that we were going to get that owner out and that we would be able to make it a successful deal. And I also think it's important to think about due diligence for anyone that owns their own company and thinks that maybe they will sell, or even if you don't think you're going to sell, assume that you might. You just never know. And if you're thinking about how would this look in a diligence process, you're probably going to run your business a little bit better. So I think it's good to just think about how would this look to an outsider, to a different investor, because you never know how things may change. And one piece of advice there for anyone that might have their own business, how you set your company up early can really make a difference in the end, as far as taxes and how much you have to pay on a gain from selling your business. So don't underinvest in attorneys and accountants and advisors who can just make sure you don't make any missteps early that can cost you later.
Mm-hmm. Some really good nuggets there. I like that. Bring in the experts when you're going through this type of process if you don't have them in-house, right? Including making sure you have a consultant that's really understands the niche of the business you're trying to buy, but also the experts once you get into the deal. So I also took away from the trust angle. It's a little bit of the smell test, right? If you really can look across from the partners. And I also think it's true. It's just like any long relationship we have in our lives, right? It doesn't usually get any better than your first few meetings, your first impressions, right?
Yeah.
So that's an important thing to think about, no matter how bad you want it, right? So to stay to that gut feel of that trust. Okay, let's keep going here. So let's talk about, you've done the due diligence, you have the deal, the numbers still look good, you're ready to go. What do you suggest are the critical steps once the deal's been made? So what increases the chance of a higher success of making this deal successful?
Mm-hmm. So let's back up from day one. So for day one to be successful, you have had to set the groundwork early, and making sure that there's not going to be any big surprises. And so maybe let me start with, what do you need to make sure you do before the deal closes? Because what happens when the money transfers over is all of a sudden there's no negotiations on anything. And I remember times when the deal had closed and we were fighting over something really small that, had the money not transferred, we'd have settled it in about 2 seconds. It wasn't anything that was going to stop the deal or change the dynamics of the deal. But now we've got to go look at the contract to see what it says about this little item. So setting expectations up front, thinking of all the hard items that the buyer or seller doesn't want to hear. If you talk about that up front before the money changes, you will be better off. I'll give you an example. After doing lots of deals, we sort of decided that in most cases, we did not ever want to keep the founder. The owner-founder usually just gets in the way. They usually can't handle it when we start changing things. And so day one, first meeting, introductory meeting, first, hi, my name is Tyra meeting, we would say, oh, and by the way, we probably are not going to keep you on past day one. And that was always devastating, but they realized it. Now, there are exceptions where that same owner stayed with us, but we wanted to set that expectation up front so that we didn't have to deal with that later on in the process. Deliver the bad news early and upfront, and it will help, because sometimes you end up getting to change your mind about that. And David, again, is probably the best example of that. Those of you that know him, he stayed on with the company and ran the business, but just like this example, we told him he was not staying. And we even on day one, we were doing a search for the head of his company. And then ultimately he got the job, stayed here for years, and was a huge success. But it would have not been that same outcome if we would have told him day one, oh, and by the way, David, we've decided we don't need you. So anything you can say up front is going to help. And this is another thing I've learned just in any job, be transparent, say it up front. And it's always going to be better than saving that bad news for later. Another thing that we would always look at was flight risk, because with a lot of deals, you'll find that the second in commands may be getting some money and then they may not be as motivated to work. And so you have to be careful that you've analyzed that and made sure that who you need to keep is motivated to stay. So if you've done all that work, then day one shouldn't be as difficult. And usually if I think about a day one, it's, except for COVID years, it is an all hands meeting. And usually the owner is there. A couple of examples where they weren't, and that owner was either saying, thank you, this is my new role, or thank you, good luck. And as soon as you kind of get past those presentations and trying to meet the key people that you haven't already been able to meet, then it's getting control of cash and financials. You definitely have to make sure that you have control of the checkbook and that you have control of the financials. And then it turns quickly to communication and relationships. You can't over communicate and you can't build too many relationships. The more employees you know, the more vendors you know, the more clients you know, the better off your chances of having success, because you're going to still learn. You're going to go, oh my gosh, we didn't think to ask that in due diligence. And so the more involved you are early on, the better off you are, because you're going to have these plans and all the things you thought you were going to do, and then things are going to change because the world changes and because there's knowledge that you just didn't completely understand. And then one more point for this, Sandy, that might be helpful is what to not do on day 1 or 2 or 5. And that would be to mess with compensation, because when you mess with compensation, you will risk losing employees, and maybe the ones you need the most. And so unless your plans is to give them more compensation, leave that alone for as long as you possibly can. And you should know, one of the due diligence questions was, is everyone fairly paid? Is anyone overpaid? If anyone's underpaid, that's a bonus, because you can give them a little more money and then they'll trust you more and maybe give you the benefit of the doubt before, considering if they want to stay under your leadership. So be very careful with that topic and postpone any compensation changes as long as you can.
Money is such an important personal issue, right? So yeah, very, very good advice. Very advice. Okay. Yeah, so there was a lot in there as well. Transparency. I think if one of the lessons kind of coming out of COVID for all leaders has been the need to increase transparency with what's going on, and just what all the changes that have happened. And I think it's interesting to hear that is so important in this process as well. The bad news first. It's a tough one for leaders. Having these tough, courageous conversations is one of the hardest things leaders do. Spend a lot of time in my practice talking to people about that. But in this case, I could see how that could really come back to bite you if that's not expressed up front. I bet that is one of the issues of where things derail pretty quick, right? If that is not communicated up front, and then you make that call on day 2 or 3 and have that hidden. So that's very, very key. Okay, great. So let's talk about culture. You talked about communication as important in relationships. But let's talk about this kind of elephant in the room, right? We always say culture eats strategy for lunch. So let's talk about how do you navigate building this new culture when you've got, 2 different, there always will be differences, obviously, and some more than others. So tell us what you do to help build that as a success, or blend. I don't know if you suggest blending them, or what you try to do to draw out the strengths, or one's supposed to go with the other. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. And, sometimes you shouldn't blend them, change them. You should just leave them alone. And there are examples of that typically when you've bought a new line of business, and it's very different than what you currently own. And integrating it is just going to add risk that isn't going to be helpful. And so most people just assume everyone needs to have the same culture, but I've seen where different cultures under the same umbrella can work well. And so first, don't jump to a conclusion that you have to do anything to change either side's culture. But what you'll find is if you've assumed a lot of cost synergies, or you've assumed a lot of sales synergies where you're going to be selling together, then you probably should assume that culture needs to be likely blended. You can say we're taking their culture and pushing it here, or vice versa, but usually something in the middle is going to be more successful. But there is absolutely not a right or wrong answer. There is a right answer for that deal. And the more collaboration you have around that, the more likely you are to succeed. And you need to make sure it's not everyone on the buy side deciding the answer to this question. You need people on both sides. And you probably need a neutral party, someone that wasn't from either the buy or sell side. And the people you choose to help you with the decision and then ultimately the plan, you have to make sure that they have self-awareness and EQ, because For example, I was a lot of times would end up on the integration team, which also is smart because I have a vested interest in it being successful. If I'm the M&A lady, you know, I want to say, and my deal was good. So having me on the integration team, obviously I care. New people coming in may question that deal and not care if it's successful. Whereas having someone with the vested interest is always good. And then I would typically represent the sell side and, or excuse me, the buy side. And I would know that sometimes my view was a little bit tainted because of course I thought my way was the right way, but at least I could see that. And when I was about to make a comment or a suggestion about the blended culture or the plan to make it work, I would qualify that by saying, I realize, you know, that this may sound self-serving because this is the way we do it, but this is what we do and this is why. And if you don't have people with that level of self-awareness, then it's just not going to go far. So make sure you have the right people, both sides are represented, and be ready to change it as you go along. And if you are having to take one culture and push it on the other and it's not blended, just know that's the riskiest path. Not changing the culture is the short-term, least risky path that can get you in trouble long-term. But if you really are going to try to move one to the other, you know, you need to make sure you have a lot of the other entities, the one who's going to be changing their culture in those conversations if you want it to be successful. And make it deliberate so that you have a better chance of being successful, but just be patient and make sure you're ready to make an audible, because a lot of times once you get in there, you'll see that you have to make an audible, especially when you start bringing in people in the organization who weren't part of the discussions of the M&A transaction.
Okay, so a lot of nuances with culture, right? There's no one-stop fit here for this category. Lots of different things to think about, and collaboration is really important. A lot of people at the table that from both sides. So lots of times there's a lot of stats that show that a lot of mergers and acquisitions fail. I mean, it's a very high number. And you know, they don't realize the return on investment, right? So tell us a little bit about what happens when you know that, you know, you've done the deal, but you're not getting the synergies, you're not getting the return on investment. You know, are there ways to save it? Is there, you know, or what do you recommend at that point?
Yeah. You know, it's just some of them don't work. And a lot of times you look back and you realize you just made bad assumptions during diligence. Sometimes, you know, the world changes. You know, what if you bought a restaurant in late 2019? You know, there's just certain things you can't foresee. But I always look at, you know, it was a bad fit, and so now you don't get your return back. A lot of times the return starts to look weak, it's not coming in, and now all of a sudden it's a bad fit because people start to panic when the numbers don't come in. And it may still very well be a good fit. You just have to, you know, sort of cut your losses and look to see what is the real issue, because time, attention, money, those things can usually fix just about any situation, and how to correct maybe the misassumptions made early. It may be changing out your culture team. It may be changing the integration plan. You know, a lot of times it does come around those sales synergies that don't come, you know, and maybe just adjusting those will get people on the right track. At some point, you know, there may be a time where you just decide, I've got to cut my losses. And we actually had a deal that we knew pretty quickly was not a great deal. And we fumbled through 2 or 3 years before we ended up selling the company back to the original founder. And that company's thriving today and doing great. And it would have never been successful under us, you know, and that's okay. Look, we didn't make any money on that deal. I think if you went back and looked, we lost money on the deal, but it would have been worse if we would have kept going. And it turned out to be a great deal for the founder to get that back and grow it again. And so you just never know what the right solution should be, but at some point you may just have to cut your losses and confirm that, okay, it wasn't a good deal. And so now let's just move on. And that could even mean, you know, selling it again. And in this example, it was selling it back to the person that sold it to us. And she's very happy about that, by the way.
That's kind of an interesting story, isn't it? Kind of a twist on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. I think certainly from your depth of knowledge in this, it's certainly sounding like, you know, this is, and we know it's complex, this whole topic. It's not to go into without a lot of knowledge and experts on your side and understanding, because it certainly sounds like, I would think the success rate of an M&A would increase with the more you've done, right? I think that the one and done strategy probably is a bit of a challenge, and we make a lot of errors on the first few. So you learn, and so the team that you put together, I think, is probably really important as another success story here, just to make sure that you've got that intelligence. Very, very, very interesting there. Okay, so I wanted to open it up for questions here and see if anyone wants to ask a question today to Tyra. And then I've got a couple other questions before we wrap up. So who would like to jump in here and ask a question?
I will. It's Tracy.
Okay.
You guys hear me?
Hi, Tracy. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm really interested on the culture piece, and I think the reason is I've been with some of the bigger organizations, and through those times, it seems that when we buy a specific vertical, we always think, well, we know best. We're the big guys. We're going to jam our culture down their throats, and then it always ends up that the organization loses its uniqueness. Mm-hmm. And doesn't seem to be. So what can you suggest? Do you suggest that you buy it and you just put it in as a standalone organization? How can you get a little bit of your culture into them? Like, how can you balance that a little better?
Yeah, I think going slow, it's never been a bad idea when it comes to culture. And there are, first of all, short term, it is less risky if you can avoid changing the culture, because you're buying them for a reason. And at least in the cases out of the 100 deals, 90% the companies were good. We weren't buying them to fix them up. We were buying them because they were good. And so you don't want to mess that up. And so you have to assume that their culture was impacting those financial results that you found attractive. And if you can leave the culture alone and it's not going to be harmful, then do that. Longer term, that strategy is probably going to have to change. But, you know, if you can wait a year or two, you're just going to know more. It's going to be less of a risky proposition when you start to change the culture. And, you know, definitely bring in their people to help with that conversation. And like you said, you always, as the big company, think you know more. Just assume that you don't. And let them be part of it. If they suggest it, it's going to come a lot easier than if the big company who acquired us suggested it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And I think Anna raised her hand. I think Anna might have a question.
Sorry, just getting myself unmuted there.
That's okay. There you go.
Tyra, there's so much great information. I was writing down because I haven't really been involved in mergers and acquisitions, but I have to say that just in terms of even good advice for new leaders, you know, no surprises, setting expectations, say things up front, be transparent, all a hands-on deck meeting when people start. You know, when I was in the GE world, that's what we did all the time. We had new manager assimilation, and when a new manager started, don't mess with compensation too early. Anyway, you had some great gems there, which I put down sort of in my leadership box, which are great things to remember. I just have a question, given the current environment that we're in, about COVID. And, you know, when you're thinking about mergers and acquisitions within this environment, are there things that leaders should be considering?
Yeah, you know, anytime there's disruption, everyone should be thinking differently than they ever had. There are companies now that are attractive, and there are companies that are weak because of COVID, and that creates opportunities. I am glad I wasn't trying to close a deal during 2020. I think it would have been very difficult, because it is hard to develop relationships with new people over Zoom. And for sure, the successful deals were because of the relationships built, and that happened over dinner and over breakfast and lunch and in the hallway. So I would say be very careful, because without those relationships, you just don't find out what you need to find out as quickly. And hopefully we're towards the end of this, so that if anyone is having to deal with that, they'll be able to go to location. We were always in the town 2 or 3 nights before and ready to meet as many people as we could. But not to pass up an opportunity because of it. Just be aware that that is a big risk that you have to try to overcome in however way, you know, you've been dealing with it so far.
Great, thank you, thanks.
Great, good. Okay, good. I want to just, we'll close out, Tyra, and I wanted to just ask you, and Anna, you kind of gave us some of those already, because I wanted to see, you know, have Tyra kind of just say what can leaders take away from this, even if they're not in the middle of an M&A, which Anna kind of gave us a few run through there, but also just last thoughts of anything else you want to add to the group on this topic before we close off.
Yeah, you know, I had written down a few things I wanted to make sure that I said during today, and I think I covered most of them, but there was one, you know, thinking maybe why mergers work or why they fail. And a lot of times it is your team. If it doesn't work, you probably were missing something. Maybe you didn't have the right diligence team or the right integration team. Most of the time it's because the wrong people left and the wrong people stayed. And so make sure you're influencing who's staying and who's leaving. Because people are ultimately going to be the reason why it worked and how well it worked. And you can't discount the people on your team. And your CFO, your due diligence team, you know, they're not winning any popularity contest through this. And so you need to have someone that is the bad guy that's going to ask the hard questions, but make sure the people in the operations who are going to be working with the new company after the merger, that they weren't the bad guy during the negotiations. So we would separate those of us. I always like to be on the good side when possible. Those of us that got to be the relationship builders and be the good guy, and then usually the CFO and the attorney who were the bad guys, because they weren't going to be forced to deal with the integration afterward. And so it's important to not ruin a relationship that is going to hurt your ability to integrate later, because now they're the boss. So let the boss, let the people that are going to be in charge post be the good guy when you have a choice of that.
Okay, that's critical, very critical. Great way to end and wrap us up, Tyra, to talk about relationships and the importance of keeping those, and the importance of people being at the center of any successful business deal, and especially M&A. So thank you so much, Tyra. It's just been an insight, a lot of learning for all of us, I think, here. Oh, see, you got some claps coming in here. So that's amazing. But a lot of insight for all of us here today. And thank you for joining the circle. It's been great to have you with us. So just before we go, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and for your time and commitment. And I want to just remind you that the next Sound Leadership webinar is Wednesday, April 21st. Once again at 12 noon, 12 to 12:45. And we're going to have someone from the not-for-profit sector speak to us about social responsibility and choosing an organization to partner with in that framework, and how best to leverage your relationships with not-for-profits as a leader, and to build engagement and culture. So we're looking forward to that. Our special guest is Miss Lauren Levicki Corville, and she runs Dress for Success in Houston. So hopefully she's got her power back on right now. So thank you so much, everyone. Great to see you all, and we'll see you in a couple months. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.